What really made the Third Reich unstoppable? For 12 years, a regime born from the wreckage of one catastrophic world war managed to conquer most of continental Europe, terrorize entire populations into submission, and sustain a global conflict that cost the lives of more than 70 million human beings. From the moment Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, something extraordinary and terrifying began to take shape. A nation humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, as gutted by hyperinflation and paralyzed by the chaos of the Weimar Republic, was suddenly transformed into the most formidable military machine the world had ever seen. Armies that had taken centuries to build were shattered in weeks. Nations that had withstood Napoleon crumbled before the German onslaught. Generals who had trained their entire lives for modern warfare found themselves outmaneuvered, outpaced, and overwhelmed by an enemy that seemed to operate by a completely different set of rules. How did this happen? What were the true engines of German power between 1933 and 1945? Was it Adolf Hitler's charisma and iron will? Was it the genius of his field marshals and generals? Was it the disciplined ferocity of the Waffen-SS or the terror of the U-boats prowling the Atlantic? Was it the machinery of propaganda that bound a nation together in fanatical loyalty? Or was it something deeper, something woven into the very structure of German society, military culture, and political organization that made the Third Reich a force unlike any the world had faced before? In this video, we are going to answer all of those questions and more. We are going to examine the full machinery of Nazi power, from the battlefield genius of Germany's greatest commanders to the ideological fanaticism that drove ordinary men to extraordinary acts of violence, from the revolutionary doctrine of blitzkrieg that shattered every preconception of modern warfare, to the submarine campaign that nearly strangled Britain into surrender. We will look at the women who stood behind the architects of terror and the children who grew up in the shadow of power. And we will examine how Germany's generals themselves assessed their adversaries and recognized the strengths and weaknesses that shaped the entire conflict. By the time we are finished, you will understand not just how the Third Reich became unstoppable, but why it ultimately was not. So without further ado, let us begin with the very foundation of German military power and the men who wielded it. To understand what made the Third Reich so devastatingly effective in the early years of the war, you have to understand the man who served as Commander-in-Chief of the German Army from 1938 to 1941. Walter von Brauchitsch was not simply a soldier who climbed through the ranks by luck or political favor. Born into a military family steeped in Prussian tradition, Brauchitsch had inherited a culture of professionalism, discipline, and strategic thinking that stretched back generations. His career had been shaped by the brutal crucible of World War I, where he had learned firsthand what mass industrial warfare could do to an army that was not prepared for it. By the time Hitler appointed him Commander-in-Chief, Brauchitsch had developed into an officer of genuine sophistication, a man who understood not just tactics but the broader art of campaign planning, logistics, and the management of modern combined arms forces. What made Brauchitsch's tenure so significant in the early successes of the Third Reich was his ability to translate Hitler's aggressive strategic instincts into coherent operational plans. His military career was marked by his strategic expertise, especially during the successful blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940. He oversaw key operations in Poland, France, and the Low Countries, and in each of those campaigns the results were breathtaking. Poland fell in 5 weeks. France and the combined Allied armies of Belgium, Britain, and the Netherlands collapsed in 6 weeks, a campaign that military historians still study with a mixture of awe and disbelief. These were not simply victories, they were annihilations. They demonstrated a level of operational art, a seamless integration of infantry, armour, artillery, and air power that no other military in the world could match at that moment in history. What drove those victories, however, was not simply Brauchitsch's administrative skill. It was a revolutionary concept of warfare that had been gestating inside the German military for years and had finally found both the political will and the material resources to be tested on a grand scale. Blitzkrieg, which translates simply as lightning war, was not a formal doctrine invented overnight. It was the product of a long institutional reckoning with the lessons of World War I, a determination to never again fight the kind of grinding, static, mass attritional warfare that had bled Germany white on the Western Front between 1914 and 1918. The key insight that German military thinkers had developed during the interwar period was that speed, shock, and disorientation could substitute for the raw mass of men and firepower that had characterized the previous war. Instead of advancing on a broad front and grinding the enemy down, German commanders would concentrate their armoured and motorised forces at a specific point in the enemy's defences, punch through that point with maximum violence and speed, and then drive deep into the enemy's rear before the defending army could react and reorganise. The goal was not just to defeat the enemy's soldiers, but to destroy the enemy's command structure, their communications, their supply lines, and their will to resist. In short, Blitzkrieg aimed to make conventional defence impossible. Brauchitsch was central to making this vision operational, but the darker side of his tenure also reveals something important about how the Third Reich sustained its power. Despite his early success, his tenure as commander-in-chief was impaired by his inability to control Adolf Hitler's increasing interference in military matters. Hitler's micromanagement undermined Brauchitsch's authority, especially during critical campaigns such as the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, which ultimately led to disaster for Germany on the Eastern Front. His health deteriorated, culminating in a heart attack in November 1941. This health crisis, coupled with the failure of Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, led to his dismissal by Hitler in December 1941. Brauchitsch spent the remainder of the war in forced retirement at his estate, effectively sidelined from further military involvement. He was arrested by British forces in August 1945 on charges of war crimes, held in custody for 3 years awaiting trial, but on October 18, 1948, fate intervened. Just as he was set to face prosecution, Brauchitsch died of pneumonia. The man who had once commanded Hitler's armies would never have to answer for his actions in a court of law. The question his case raises is profound. How much does the quality of military leadership matter when the political structure above it is corrupting everything it touches? To answer that question, we need to look at the man who may have been the most brilliant operational mind in the entire German war machine. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein is widely regarded by military historians as one of the most gifted commanders of the entire Second World War on either side. His genius lay not in brute force or the management of massive formations, but in the ability to see opportunities that no one else could see, to devise plans of stunning boldness that his own side sometimes refused to believe were serious, and then to execute those plans with a precision and aggression that left his enemies utterly helpless. Born in 1887, Manstein had developed his strategic instincts across decades of professional study and World War I experience. By the time the Second Great Conflict began, he was a man of refined military intellect operating at the very peak of his powers. His first great contribution to the Third Reich's military supremacy came during the planning phase for the fall of France in 1940. When the German High Command developed its initial plan for the Western offensive, it was essentially a rerun of the old Schlieffen Plan from World War I, a sweeping advance through Belgium and the Netherlands designed to roll up the Allied line from the north. It was a cautious, predictable plan, and Manstein could see immediately that it would fail. The French had anticipated exactly this kind of move and had positioned their best armies to meet it. Manstein proposed something entirely different. He argued that the main German armoured thrust should go through the Ardennes forest in southern Belgium, a region that military planners on both sides had always considered impassable for large armoured formations. If it worked, German armour would burst out of the Ardennes directly behind the Allied forces deployed in Belgium, cutting them off from France surrounding them and destroying them in detail. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity, and when Manstein first presented it, his superiors dismissed it as fantastical. Hitler, however, heard about it and embraced it with enthusiasm. The rest is military history. Germany's armour tore through the Ardennes, reached the English Channel in 10 days and trapped the bulk of the Allied forces in the north. France surrendered in 6 weeks. In one dazzling operational stroke, Manstein had demonstrated that the Third Reich's military machine was not just powerful, but genuinely creative, capable of inventing solutions that no one else had imagined. Manstein's subsequent career on the Eastern Front only deepened his reputation. After commanding an infantry corps during the French assault and becoming a general in June 1940, he led the 56th Panzer Corps in the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, driving so fast that he nearly captured Leningrad single-handedly. He then took command of the 11th Army on the Southern Front, capturing 430,000 Soviet prisoners and successfully resisting fierce Soviet counteroffensives. His capture of the strategic fortress city of Sevastopol in July 1942, after a prolonged siege, resulted in his promotion to Field Marshal. Even after Germany's strategic position began to deteriorate catastrophically, Manstein demonstrated a genius for defensive operations that repeatedly stabilized the Eastern Front when it seemed on the verge of total collapse. His dramatic recapture of Kharkov in February 1943, just weeks after the surrender at Stalingrad, was one of the most skillful counteroffensive operations of the entire war. Despite his efforts to relieve the encircled Sixth Army at Stalingrad and his brilliant defensive maneuvering across the vast distances of southern Russia, he was dismissed by Hitler in March 1944. What does Manstein's career tell us about German power? It tells us that at the operational level, Germany had commanders of world historical quality, men whose military thinking was generations ahead of their adversaries. But it also tells us that this genius was operating within a political system that would ultimately destroy it. The relationship between Germany's professional military leadership and the Blitzkrieg concept was further embodied in Field Marshal Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist, a commander whose career traced the arc of German armoured power, from its brilliant early triumphs to its eventual exhaustion. Kleist came from a family with a long history of military service, and his career spanned both World War I and World War II. He was particularly recognised for his leadership during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns, commanding the 1st Panzer Group during the invasion of France in 1940, leading a fast-moving armoured thrust that penetrated deep into French defences and contributed decisively to the swift German victory. His armoured formations moved with a speed and aggression that French commanders simply could not match, partly because of superior German tactics, and partly because the French High Command was still thinking in the cautious, methodical terms of the previous war. In 1941, Kleist was involved in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Commanding the 1st Panzer Army, he led some of the largest tank battles in history, including the massive encirclements of Soviet forces at Uman and Kyiv. The numbers were staggering. At Kyiv alone, more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped and forced to surrender in what remains one of the largest encirclement operations in military history. These operations inflicted losses on the Red Army that would have destroyed any other army on Earth. However, Kleist's campaigns in the Soviet Union also began to reveal the limits of German military strategy as logistical challenges, and the harsh Russian winter eventually stalled the German offensive. The deeper Germany penetrated into the Soviet Union, the longer and more vulnerable its supply lines became, and the harder it was to maintain the tempo of operations that Blitzkrieg required. Kleist's career took a significant turn in 1942 when he was appointed commander of Army Group A during the German offensive into the Caucasus. His forces were tasked with capturing the vital oil fields of the region, but the campaign faltered due to the overextension of German resources and fierce Soviet resistance. By early 1943, the Germans were forced to retreat from the Caucasus, marking a turning point that presaged the broader strategic reversal on the Eastern Front. On March 30th, 1944, after a series of retreats and failures, Kleist was dismissed by Hitler. After the war, he was captured by Allied forces and handed over to Yugoslavia, where he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for war crimes. He was later extradited to the Soviet Union, where he faced trial for crimes related to his commands on the Eastern Front, and was sentenced to 25 years in a correctional labour camp. On November 13, 1954, he died of heart failure while imprisoned at Vladimir Central Prison in the Soviet Union, one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet captivity. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was perhaps the most versatile and experienced operational commander in the German army, a man whose career stretched across both world wars and who was trusted by Hitler with supreme command on multiple fronts at different points in the conflict. His military career had begun with service as a staff officer during World War I, and during the interwar years he had risen steadily through the hierarchy of the Reichswehr, reaching the rank of Colonel General before retiring in 1938. When World War II began, he was called back from retirement to lead Army Group South during the Polish invasion, and his performance there confirmed that age had not dulled his tactical instincts. He briefly lost his command in December 1941 for authorizing the Rostov retreat, a decision that was militarily correct but politically unacceptable to Hitler, and was reinstated as Western Commander-in-Chief in 1942. As the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, von Rundstedt was assigned to help contain the situation. He quickly saw with clear eyes what many in Hitler's entourage refused to acknowledge, that the Normandy landing could not be repelled. Following a failed counterattack near Caen on July 1st, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel asked him what should be done. Von Rundstedt's response was magnificent in its brutal honesty. He famously retorted, "Make peace, you fools! What else can you do?" This blunt statement of military reality cost him his command the following day. He was recalled one final time as Commander-in-Chief in the West in September 1944, a position he held until Hitler dismissed him again in March 1945. On May 1st, 1945, the day after Hitler's suicide in Berlin, troops from the 36th Infantry Division made him a prisoner of war. He faced charges related to the severity order that had led to mass murders in occupied Soviet territory, but due to his advanced age and deteriorating health, he was never put on trial and was released in July 1948. He spent his retirement in Schloss Oppershausen in Lower Saxony, continually troubled by heart conditions until his death on February 24, 1953. Rundstedt's career illustrates a central paradox of German military power. These were often men of genuine professional quality who served a criminal regime, and the question of where professional duty ended and moral complicity began would haunt German military culture for generations. Among all the elements that made the Third Reich a formidable military power in the opening years of the war, few were as significant as the integrated use of air power with ground forces, and no figure embodied this integration more completely than Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the man whose affable manner earned him the nickname Smiling Albert, but whose strategic vision made him one of Germany's most effective and resilient commanders across multiple theatres. Kesselring's military career started in World War I and continued into the era of the Weimar Republic before he shifted to the Luftwaffe in 1935. A year later, he earned his stripes as a lieutenant general and became chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe. His role in World War II was significant from the very beginning, leading air fleets during the campaigns in Poland and France and playing a crucial part in the Battle of Britain. The use of Luftwaffe aircraft to support ground troops was not incidental to German success in Poland and France. It was essential. German dive bombers, particularly the infamous Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, became a weapon of psychological terror as well as tactical effect, their distinctive wailing. Sound designed specifically to shatter the nerves of troops who had never experienced aerial attack in coordination with armoured assault. The combination of panzer columns crashing through defensive lines while bombers obliterated artillery positions, headquarters and supply columns was overwhelming. No army in 1939 or 1940 had developed the doctrine, the communication systems, or the psychological preparation to withstand this kind of integrated assault. After the attack on the Soviet Union began, Kesselring took up the position of Commander-in-Chief South, and following the Allied invasions of Sicily and Italy in 1943, he devised a defensive strategy on the Italian peninsula that delayed an Allied victory for over a year, extracting maximum cost from Allied forces advancing up a narrow mountainous terrain that inherently favoured the defender. Taking over as Commander-in-Chief West in March 1945, he could not stop the Allied push into Germany but fought to the last, ultimately surrendering the southern German forces on May 7, 1945. In October 1945, he was called as a witness in the Allies' first war crimes trial after the war. 2 years later, in 1947, a British military court in Venice found him guilty of war crimes, specifically for ordering the execution of 335 Italian civilian hostages in the Ardeatine Caves massacre in March 1944, a reprisal for an Italian partisan attack that had killed 33 German soldiers. Initially sentenced to death on May 6, 1947, His sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. He was pardoned and released in 1952 because of his declining health, after which he became involved in numerous veterans associations and spent his final years writing his memoirs. He passed away in 1960. Kesselring's case illustrates one of the most uncomfortable truths about German military effectiveness. Many of the commanders who made the Wehrmacht so formidable on the battlefield were also complicit in or directly responsible for atrocities that cannot be excused by any appeal to military necessity or professional duty. What, then, was the common thread that ran through all of these remarkable military careers? What gave the German military machine its extraordinary effectiveness in the early years of the war? The answer lies partly in doctrine, partly in leadership quality, and partly in an institutional culture that had evolved over decades to prize initiative, flexibility, and speed of decision-making above all other military virtues. The German military concept of Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, was central to this. Under Auftragstaktik, commanders at every level of the hierarchy were given clear objectives and then trusted to find their own ways of achieving those objectives. They were not required to wait for orders from above before acting on opportunities that presented themselves. They were expected to use their own judgment, to adapt to changing circumstances in real time, and to accept that their superior's intent mattered more than the specific instructions they had been given. This philosophy produced an army of aggressive, independent-minded commanders at every level, from field marshals down to company officers and even individual tank commanders, who could exploit opportunities faster than their opponents could react to them. It was this quality above all others that made German blitzkrieg so devastating, not just the tanks and the aircraft, but the human decision-making system that used them. The contrast with the armies Germany faced in the early years of the war was stark and often tragic. French commanders in 1940 were operating under a system that required permission from above before any significant action could be taken. British commanders were trained in a tradition that valued caution, preparation, and the conservation of forces. Polish commanders were fighting with courage and determination, but with equipment and doctrine that belonged to an earlier era of warfare. Against the fluid, aggressive, initiative-driven German style of combat, these armies were repeatedly wrong-footed, outmaneuvered and destroyed before they could organize a coherent response. But what would happen when Germany faced an adversary who could match and eventually surpass it? That question would define the entire second half of the war, and the answers would prove fatal to the Third Reich. Before we go further, let us ask a question that gets to the heart of German military power. How did Germany's own generals assess the adversaries they faced? Their answers are revealing because they illuminate both the strengths of the German military system and the limitations that would eventually prove its undoing. General Alfred Jodl, who served as the chief of the operations staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht throughout the war, once described George Patton in terms that capture something essential about how German commanders saw their opponents. He was the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. The comparison to Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's Panzer doctrine and arguably the father of modern armoured warfare, was the highest possible praise that a German officer could bestow on an enemy commander. What Jodl was saying, without quite saying it, was that Patton thought and fought the way Germans were supposed to think and fight, with audacity, speed, and a willingness to accept risk in pursuit of decisive results. Heinz Guderian himself, the mastermind behind Germany's blitzkrieg strategy, could not help but admire Patton's tactical prowess. He was quoted as saying, "I hear much about General Patton, and he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." This statement is remarkable in its generosity and its precision. Guderian was not simply being polite. He was identifying in Patton a kindred military spirit, a commander who had independently arrived at the same conclusions about mobile warfare that the Germans had been developing for decades. General Günther Blumentritt, who was a key planner of the invasions of France and Poland, described Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, noting that his operations had impressed the Germans enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. Patton's command style also drew direct parallels with the German concept of Auftragstaktik. He famously told his officers, "Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity." It was pure German military philosophy expressed in American idiom. Yet the German view of Patton was not universally positive, and the nuances of their criticism reveal something important about the limits of German self-assessment. Some commanders saw him more as a tactical genius than a strategic mastermind. Some felt that Patton's rapid advance in Sicily was more about personal glory than strategic necessity. Military historian Harry Yide described Patton's rush to Messina as a display of empty glory. More significantly, some German military thinkers pointed out that Patton's logistical accomplishments, while impressive, were often made possible by the sheer scale of resources available to the Allies, a scale that Germany could never match. This observation cuts to the core of Germany's ultimate strategic vulnerability. The Third Reich was never going to win a prolonged industrial war of attrition against the combined productive capacity of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. German military genius, for all its brilliance at the operational level, could not compensate indefinitely for the fundamental imbalance in material resources. The German general's view of British forces was equally complex and equally revealing. You might think the Germans saw their British adversaries as pushovers, but the reality was far more nuanced. German generals held a genuine and somewhat grudging respect for British forces, particularly when it came to their resilience and professionalism. General Siegfried Westphal, a high-ranking German officer, once remarked that the British divisions were the hardest, toughest in attack, and most persistent in defence. German military assessments consistently highlighted what they called the uniformity of the British personnel, an absence of the catastrophic failures and collapses that had characterised some other Allied forces in the early years of the war. Despite this admiration for British troops, German commanders often viewed British leadership as overly cautious. General Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, expressed this frustration when he said to captured British officers after the siege of Tobruk, "Gentlemen, you have fought like lions and been led by donkeys." It was a brutal assessment, but it captured a real tension in British military culture between the courage of individual soldiers and the institutional conservatism of the command structure. Hitler's own view of Britain added another layer of strategic complexity to the conflict. In his mind, the British were potential natural allies for Germany, a fellow Northern European people whom he believed should be working with Germany rather than against it. He convinced himself that Jews were manipulating British policy, turning a natural ally into an enemy. This bizarre ideological framework had real strategic consequences. It contributed to Hitler's decision not to authorize the destruction of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk in May 1940, allowing the British to evacuate over 330,000 soldiers who would later form the core of the army that fought back across North Africa and eventually into France. It influenced his continued hope, even after the Battle of Britain had been lost, that Britain might still negotiate a separate peace. In a very real sense, Hitler's racism distorted his strategic judgment in ways that ultimately helped his enemies. One area where German respect for British capabilities was particularly evident was in the air war. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, grudgingly acknowledged British technological expertise when he said, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. The British knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft and they give it a speed which they have now increased yet again." The Mosquito, built from wood at a time when Germany was pouring resources into ever more complex metal aircraft, was one of the most versatile and effective aircraft of the entire war, a bomber, fighter, reconnaissance aircraft and night fighter all in one, and Göring's fury at its existence reveals a deeper anxiety about German technological assumptions. Germany had assumed that its industrial sophistication gave it an inherent advantage in military technology. The British Mosquito demonstrated that creativity and ingenuity could sometimes outperform brute industrial capacity. The German perception of Soviet forces underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of the entire war, and that transformation illuminates more than anything else the fatal miscalculation at the heart of the Third Reich's strategic vision. Initially, when German commanders looked east, they saw what Nazi ideology told them to see: a racially inferior people, poorly led, badly equipped, and incapable of standing up to the German military machine. At the start of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, many German commanders expected the Soviet Union to collapse within weeks, perhaps months at most. Nazi racial theories painted Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans, and the Red Army as the armed extension of a backward and fundamentally degraded civilization. These were not peripheral beliefs held by extremists at the margins of German military culture. They were mainstream assumptions that shaped operational planning at the highest levels. What happened in the summer and autumn of 1941 began to shake those assumptions, even if most German commanders were slow to acknowledge what they were learning. Field Marshal Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist, reflecting years later on the opening months of Barbarossa, stated, "From the very beginning, the Russians proved themselves first-class warriors. Our successes in the first months of the war can be explained by better training. Having gained combat experience, the Russians became first-class soldiers, and they fought with exceptional perseverance and had astounding endurance." This grudging admission from a man who had initially shared German assumptions about Soviet inferiority is significant. The Red Army that Germany encountered in June 1941 was indeed poorly prepared, poorly led at the senior levels because of Stalin's purges of the officer corps, and initially overwhelmed by the speed and violence of the German assault. But it did not collapse. It kept fighting. It absorbed losses that would have utterly destroyed any other army in history and kept regenerating, kept learning, kept adapting. Franz Halder, a German general and the Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, wrote in his diary about the Soviet capacity for resistance. It seems the enemy, on the initiative of the new command and also perhaps under the influence of England, makes every effort to hold the front line and not allow us to move further east. Russian troops are fighting, as before, with the greatest tenacity and severity. The Battle of Stalingrad from August 1942 to February 1943 marked the definitive turning point in German perceptions of Soviet military power. The Red Army's ability to encircle and destroy an entire German army, the Sixth Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, shattered every remaining illusion of Soviet inferiority. This was not just a tactical victory or even a strategic victory. It was a demonstration that the Soviet military had mastered the kind of deep operational thinking, the ability to plan and execute complex, large-scale encirclements that the Germans had always considered their exclusive province. As Soviet counteroffensives gained momentum through 1943 and 1944, German commanders found themselves facing an opponent that was not only numerically overwhelming, but increasingly skilled, well-equipped, and strategically sophisticated. The fear that began to grip German forces was palpable. They were no longer fighting an inferior enemy who could be crushed by superior German quality. They were fighting a juggernaut growing stronger with each passing month. This evolution in German thinking had profound implications for the entire conduct of the war. The confidence that had characterized the early stages of Operation Barbarossa gave way to a more cautious and ultimately desperate approach. The Wehrmacht's strategic situation deteriorated steadily from the winter of 1941 onward, and the men at the apex of the German command structure, men like Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel, became increasingly caught between the realities of the military situation and Hitler's increasingly irrational demands. Alfred Jodl, holding the rank of General Oberst, served as the chief of the operations staff within the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht throughout the duration of the war. He was, in many ways, the man who translated Hitler's strategic visions into operational directives, and his position at the intersection of political leadership and military execution made him both indispensable to the Third Reich's war-making capacity and deeply complicit in its crimes. Jodl was apprehended by British soldiers on 23 May 1945, alongside the rest of Admiral Dönitz's Flensburg government. He was initially confined in Camp Ashcan before being presented to the International Military Tribunal at the Nuremberg trials. He stood accused of scheming to perpetrate crimes against peace, initiating and conducting wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The primary accusations tied to his name were his endorsement of the Commando Order and the Commissar Order, which mandated the immediate execution of specific categories of prisoners of war upon their capture. Jodl attempted to justify the 1941 mass shootings of Soviet POWs by asserting that only those prisoners who chose not to walk were executed, not those physically unable to do so. It was the kind of twisted legal hair-splitting that the tribunal found, rightly, to be an obscenity. Jodl pleaded not guilty but was found guilty on all 4 counts and subsequently hanged in Nuremberg prison on October 16, 1946. His final utterance before the trapdoor opened was, "Ich grüße dich, mein ewiges Deutschland," which translates as, "I salute you, my eternal Germany." It was the declaration of a man who had never truly reckoned with what that Germany had done. If Jodl was the operational brain of Hitler's war machine, then Wilhelm Keitel was its loyal administrative spine. Keitel was one of Adolf Hitler's closest and most trusted associates, serving as the chief of Hitler's personal military staff throughout the war. His military career during World War I had mostly involved staff officer and administrative roles, and during the Weimar Republic he had demonstrated the organizational ability that would eventually bring him to Hitler's attention. He gained promotion to Major General in 1933 and took command of an infantry division in 1934. It was during this period that Keitel developed a strong and increasingly personal admiration for Hitler that would define every decision he made for the rest of his life. From 1935 to 1938, Hitler restructured the German High Command, removing several generals he considered disloyal or insufficiently compliant. Keitel's involvement in devising a consolidated command structure that would give Hitler direct and unmediated control over the military caught Hitler's attention, leading to his appointment as its leader in 1938. Following his promotion, Keitel played a significant role in bringing Austria and Czechoslovakia under Nazi control without firing a shot, part of the Third Reich's strategy of using the credible threat of military force to achieve political objectives without the costs and risks of actual war. He participated in planning the 1939 attack on Poland, outlined the terms of surrender to the French government in 1940, and after Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal that same year, quickly began planning the invasion of the Soviet Union. Keitel's significance to German power during this period was not primarily military. He was not a battlefield commander of distinction. His significance was as the institutional mechanism through which Hitler's will was translated into military action, the man who ensured that orders were issued, followed, and executed without the friction that a more assertive or independent-minded military staff might have introduced. In this sense, Keitel's weakness, his absolute deference to Hitler's authority, was precisely what made him valuable to the regime. He was captured by the British in May 1945 and subsequently indicted for war crimes by the International Military Tribunal. During his trial in Nuremberg, unlike most defendants, Keitel accepted responsibility for his actions, acknowledging that he was responsible for all outcomes resulting from his signed orders. In October 1946, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Despite his request for execution by military firing squad, which was denied, Keitel was hanged on October 16, 1946, in Nuremberg. The structure of Germany's military leadership, from the brilliant operational commanders like Manstein and Kleist to the administrative enablers like Keitel, was one pillar of the Third Reich's power. But there was another pillar that was in many ways even more important, and it was not military at all. It was ideological. The Nazi Party and its associated organizations did something that no purely professional military organization could do. They created an entire alternative universe of meaning and purpose that bound the German population together in a project of national renewal and racial dominance that millions of people found genuinely compelling. To understand the full scope of German power between 1933 and 1945, you have to understand what it meant to believe in National Socialism and what happened to the people who were closest to those beliefs. The wives of Nazi leaders occupied a peculiar and revealing position within this ideological universe. They were not simply the domestic partners of powerful men. In many cases, they were active participants in the system, true believers who shared their husbands' worldviews and, in some cases, facilitated or extended the regime's power in ways that have been systematically understated by post-war history. Take Ilse Hess, who led a life marked by her unwavering allegiance to the Nazi Party and her marriage to Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler's deputy. Ilse and Rudolf Hess had met in the early 1920s, and their relationship had blossomed in the rising tide of National Socialism. In 1921, she had initially joined the Nazi Party and then rejoined in 1925 after the party had been banned and reconstituted. It was Ilse who introduced Hess to Adolf Hitler, and Hitler played a significant role in facilitating the marriage between them, which occurred on December 20th, 1927, in Munich. Hitler stood as the godfather to their only child, Wolf Hess, born in 1937. These were not casual social connections. They were the bonds of a genuine political family, people united not just by personal affection, but by shared ideology and mutual commitment to the Nazi project. When Hess made his bizarre solo flight to Scotland in May 1941 in a futile attempt to negotiate peace with Britain, Ilse remained a staunch defender of his intentions and continued to support the party even after her husband's imprisonment. After World War II ended, Ilse Hess was arrested and sent to an internment camp in Augsburg. When released, she moved to Allgäu and opened a boarding house, but she never repudiated the ideology she had helped to build. She remained a devoted supporter of National Socialism until her death, providing support to Stille Hilfe, a secretive relief organization for arrested, condemned and fugitive SS members, essentially an underground network for protecting war criminals. She published a controversial book in 1952 and spent her later years campaigning for her husband's release from Spandau prison, where he was held until his death in 1987. Ilse Hess passed away on September 7, 1995, having remained true to the ideology that had caused the deaths of millions of people. Her life raises uncomfortable questions about the boundaries of complicity. How much did it matter that she had not personally ordered killings? She had believed in, advocated for, and sustained a regime that did. Beyond Blitzkrieg, there was another dimension of the Third Reich's power that has sometimes been overlooked in popular accounts focused on tanks and aircraft and submarines. The Nazi regime had made a series of ruthless decisions about economic mobilization that gave Germany extraordinary military capacity relative to its peacetime economic size. The rearmament program begun in 1933 and accelerating dramatically through the late 1930s, transformed Germany's industrial base in ways that created both genuine military economic strength and, ultimately, dangerous structural vulnerabilities. Under the direction of men like Hermann Göring, who served as plenipotentiary of the Four-Year Plan from 1936 onward, and later Albert Speer, who became Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production in 1942, Germany extracted enormous military output from its economy through a combination of directed investment, slave labor, the plunder of conquered territories, and an increasingly brutal set of priorities that stripped consumption to the bone in order to maximize military production. The slave labor dimension of German military economic power is one of the most important and most morally significant aspects of the Third Reich's capacity to wage war. Albert Speer Sr., the brilliant architect who became Germany's armaments minister, is perhaps the most complex figure in this story. His organizational genius in rationalizing German war production genuinely extended the duration of the war, delaying Allied victory and causing additional millions of deaths. And the production he organized was overwhelmingly dependent on forced labor drawn from concentration camps, prisoner of war camps, and the populations of occupied territories. Speer's post-war claim that he had known nothing of the Holocaust has been comprehensively demolished by historians, but the broader point stands: the Third Reich's military-economic power rested on a foundation of human exploitation so vast and so systematic that it constitutes one of history's most extensive crimes against humanity. This was not an unfortunate side effect of the war effort. It was a central component of German strategy. The question of how German propaganda sustained the population's willingness to fight and sacrifice even as the military situation deteriorated catastrophically is another essential element of the Third Reich's power. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, was perhaps the most sophisticated practitioner of mass media manipulation that the world had yet produced. From the moment the Nazis came to power in 1933, Goebbels worked systematically to transform every medium of communication: radio, film, newspapers, public rallies, architecture, art, and even everyday conversations into instruments for projecting a unified ideological message. The genius of Nazi propaganda lay not simply in its scale but in its psychological sophistication. It appealed simultaneously to fear and to pride, to resentment of the humiliations of Versailles, and to excitement at Germany's new national greatness, to tribal solidarity within the Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, and to hatred of the designated enemies who were portrayed as threatening its existence. This emotional cocktail proved extraordinarily powerful, capable of sustaining popular commitment to the regime even under the most adverse conditions. What made German propaganda particularly effective was its integration with the broader social and cultural apparatus of the Nazi state. The Hitler Youth trained the next generation of soldiers and believers from childhood. The League of German Girls shaped the values and expectations of women who would become the wives and mothers of the regime. The mandatory labor service built habits of discipline and collective identity that carried over into military service. The Nazi Party's system of local officials, the Blockleiters who monitored individual households for signs of dissent, created a pervasive social pressure toward conformity that supplemented ideological conviction with the fear of denunciation. In this environment, expressing doubts about the regime or the conduct of the war was not just socially difficult, it could be genuinely dangerous. People self-censored not only in public but increasingly in private, and the gap between what Germans actually believed and what they were willing to say grew steadily wider as the war turned against Germany and the propaganda became more obviously disconnected from reality. The military genius of the Third Reich was also expressed through a set of specific tactical and technological innovations that gave German forces decisive advantages in the opening campaigns of the war. The panzer forces that led Germany's blitzkrieg attacks were not simply superior in quantity to their opponents' armoured forces. In many cases, they were not even superior in the quality of individual tank designs. In 1940, the French Char B1 and the British Matilda were in some respects technically superior to the German Panzer III and Panzer IV. What German armour had that French and British armour lacked was doctrine, communication, and integration. Every German tank carried a radio, allowing immediate communication between individual vehicles and between tanks and their commanders. This seems simple, but its tactical implications were revolutionary. German armoured units could react to changing battlefield conditions in real time, adapt to unexpected obstacles, and exploit opportunities that appeared and disappeared in minutes. French and British tanks, many of which lacked radios or had limited communication capability, were reduced to fighting as individual machines rather than as coordinated units, and the difference was decisive. The role of German air power as an integral component of ground operations was another decisive advantage in the early campaigns. The Luftwaffe's close air support mission, the use of dive bombers and fighter bombers to attack enemy positions, artillery, headquarters, and supply columns in direct support of advancing ground troops, was something that no other air force in the world had developed to the same degree of tactical sophistication. The screaming Stuka dive bomber had a psychological effect on enemy troops that went well beyond its physical destructiveness. It represented a new dimension of the battlefield, one that defenders had no established doctrine for dealing with, and the terror it produced was a genuine force multiplier that magnified the effect of German ground attacks far beyond what the physical damage alone would have produced. This psychological dimension of German military power, the deliberate cultivation of fear and shock as tactical weapons, was central to Blitzkrieg's success. Erwin Rommel, who would eventually become Field Marshal and earn the title the Desert Fox through his campaigns in North Africa, embodied the qualities of German military leadership in their most dramatic and personally charismatic form. Rommel was not primarily a strategic thinker on the level of Manstein. His gift was tactical and operational. The ability to be present at the decisive point at the decisive moment, to read a battle as it unfolded and react with a speed and boldness that consistently left his opponents reeling. In North Africa from 1941 to 1943, commanding the Afrika Korps and later the German-Italian Panzer Army, Rommel conducted campaigns of such brilliance that he earned genuine admiration from the Allied commanders he was fighting. He attacked when he was supposed to defend, defended when he was expected to attack, and consistently extracted results from limited resources that seemed impossible to explain in purely material terms. The British press, following Churchill's example, called him a military genius, the one German commander who could be admired without reservation, because he seemed to be fighting a clean war, a soldier's war, far from the atrocities of the Eastern Front. This image was partly mythological, as German propaganda was quick to exploit Rommel's charisma and the Afrika Korps' achievements for its own purposes. But it contained a real core. Rommel in North Africa was genuinely a commander of exceptional quality, and the German opinion of Allied commanders was partly shaped by the experience of fighting men like Bernard Montgomery, the British general who eventually stopped Rommel at El Alamein in November 1942. The German view of Montgomery was mixed. They respected his organizational ability and his refusal to be bounced into premature attacks, but they found his caution frustrating and his eventual victory as much a product of material superiority as of military skill. Montgomery had more tanks, more aircraft, more fuel, and more supplies. He could afford to be methodical in a way that Rommel, perpetually short of everything, could not. The contrast embodied the fundamental strategic reality that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. Germany was always going to run out of resources before its enemies did. The High Command trial at Nuremberg, in which many of Germany's senior military commanders were prosecuted for war crimes, raised questions about accountability and justice that the passage of nearly 80 years has still not fully resolved. Some commanders, like Keitel and Jodl, were executed. Others, like Manstein and Kesselring, served prison terms before being released. Still others, like Brauchitsch, died before trial. And some, like Weichs, avoided trial on medical grounds that later proved somewhat elastic in their application. The uneven nature of the legal outcomes reflected both the genuine complexity of establishing individual responsibility in a vast military bureaucracy and the political pressures of the early Cold War period, during which the Western Allies were beginning to contemplate the rearmament of West Germany and had reason to prefer a narrative in which the Wehrmacht's senior commanders had been professional soldiers rather than ideological criminals. This convenient fiction, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, untainted by the crimes of the SS, was maintained for decades before being comprehensively dismantled by subsequent historical research. The Nuremberg trials themselves represented something historically unprecedented, an attempt by the victorious powers to hold the leaders of a defeated regime accountable not just for the conduct of war, but for the decision to wage aggressive war in the first place, and for crimes against humanity committed against civilian populations. The legal precedents established at Nuremberg, the principles that individuals could be held criminally responsible for state actions and that following orders was not an absolute defense, were among the most significant legal innovations of the 20th century. They were also inevitably imperfect in their application, shaped by the political priorities of the moment and the limitations of what could be proven in a court of law. The field marshals and generals who escaped or evaded prosecution were not, in most cases, innocent of the crimes with which they might have been charged. They were simply fortunate in the precise circumstances of their cases. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's case raises particularly sharp questions in this regard. His nickname Smiling Albert and his reputation as a skilled defensive commander in Italy have sometimes overshadowed the specific act for which he was convicted, ordering the execution of 335 Italian civilian hostages in the Ardeatine caves on March 24, 1944, in retaliation for a partisan attack that had killed 33 German soldiers. The ratio of 10 civilian deaths for every German soldier killed was itself a war crime under international law. The choice of victims was arbitrary and brutal. The killings were carried out in secret, and the bodies were hidden in an effort to conceal the evidence. Kesselring authorized this action. He was convicted of it and sentenced to death, a sentence that was commuted to life imprisonment and then reduced to his release in 1952 on medical grounds. He lived until 1960, long enough to write his memoirs and to participate in veterans' organizations. The 335 people killed in the Ardeatine caves have no such epilogue. The Field Marshal, Georg von Kuchler, who admitted in court that POW conditions under his command were harsh, but attributed this to an act of God rather than deliberate policy, represents another facet of how senior German commanders attempted to manage accountability for their actions. Kuchler had commanded forces whose treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was so brutal that tens of thousands died not in combat, but in improvised camps from exposure, starvation, and disease, deaths that were the direct consequence of deliberate policy decisions about how Soviet prisoners were to be handled. His suggestion that these deaths were the result of winter weather rather than human decisions was a legal defense, not an honest accounting of what happened. The court did not fully accept this defense, but neither did it reject it entirely, and Küchler's eventual sentence of 20 years reduced to 12, and his release in 1953 reflected the complex moral compromises that characterized the entire process of post-war accountability. What all of these cases share is the fundamental tension at the heart of any attempt to use legal mechanisms to address mass atrocity. Individual criminal law is designed to deal with individual acts. The crimes of the Third Reich were systemic, embedded in bureaucratic structures following chains of command that extended from Hitler at the top down through dozens of levels of military and civilian authority to the men who actually pulled the triggers or operated the gas chambers. Assigning individual criminal responsibility within such a system is inherently difficult, and the results are inherently partial. Some people who bore the greatest responsibility escaped justice entirely, through death, flight, or the limitations of available evidence. Some people who bore lesser individual responsibility were executed or imprisoned. The overall result, while representing an important step forward in the development of international humanitarian law, fell far short of the full accounting that the scale of the crimes demanded. And yet, imperfect as the post-war reckoning was, it accomplished something genuinely significant. It established as a matter of enforceable law and not merely of political aspiration that aggressive war was illegal, that crimes against humanity were crimes regardless of the citizenship of perpetrators or victims, and that sovereign authority did not exempt government officials from individual criminal responsibility for their actions. These principles have been invoked and applied, imperfectly and inconsistently, in the decades since Nuremberg, in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, in the International Criminal Court, and in the domestic courts of countries that have incorporated international criminal law into their legal systems. The legacy of the Nuremberg trials, like the legacy of the Third Reich itself, continues to shape the world we inhabit. The case of Margaret Himmler is even more disturbing because it illustrates how the ideology of the Third Reich could inhabit someone who had seemingly started from a position of genuine compassion. Margaret Himmler had initially trained as a nurse with the intention of saving lives during World War I. After the war, she transitioned to the German Red Cross hospital and, with her father's financial support, managed a private nursing clinic. The woman who first crossed paths with Heinrich Himmler during one of his lecture tours in 1927 was, on paper, a person whose life's work had been the alleviation of suffering. Yet she married Himmler in July 1928, joined the Nazi Party that same year, and became an active and willing participant in a regime whose systematic cruelty would eventually become the defining crime of the 20th century. Margaret Himmler was far from a passive spectator in her husband's activities. She regularly arranged gatherings for the spouses of high-ranking SS leaders, creating social networks that reinforced the bonds of loyalty and shared purpose among the regime's inner circle. By the end of 1939, she was overseeing the operation of Red Cross hospitals throughout Berlin-Brandenburg, a role that took her into German-occupied territories. Her diary records a trip to occupied Poland in March 1940, and her description of what she saw there is a window into the casual dehumanization that the Nazi worldview had produced in otherwise unremarkable people. Her contemptuous language about the people she encountered in Posen, Łódź, and Warsaw reveals a woman who had fully absorbed the racist ideology of the regime and applied it to living human beings she encountered on a professional visit. In February 1945, even as Germany's military situation was collapsing catastrophically on all fronts, Margaret wrote to Gebhard Himmler, her husband's brother, expressing pride in Heinrich's role. "How wonderful that he has been called to great tasks and is equal to them. The whole of Germany is looking to him." The whole of Germany was looking to a man who was at that moment overseeing the administration of death camps across occupied Europe. When the war concluded, Margaret was subjected to numerous investigations probing the extent of her knowledge regarding her husband's affairs. She denied awareness and pleaded to be cleared of Nazi association. After a prolonged deliberation in 1953, she was deemed a profiteer of the Nazi regime and sentenced to 30 days of penal labour. She was stripped of her voting rights and pension eligibility. After her release, she lived under the pseudonym Margaret Boden until her death in 1967, trying to distance herself from her past. But the distance was illusory. You cannot simply change your name and step out of history. Lena Heydrich's story takes the involvement of Nazi wives to an even more direct level. Lena's journey into Nazism began when her brother Hans, an ardent member of the Nazi Party and the SA, took her to a rally in 1929 where Hitler delivered a speech that she later described as a revelation. She joined the party and threw herself into its ideological world with genuine conviction. It was at a rowing club ball in Kiel at the age of 19 that she met Naval Lieutenant Reinhard Heydrich, who would become one of the most feared men in the entire Nazi hierarchy. Their engagement was announced on December 18, 1930. The following year, Heydrich faced charges of conduct unbecoming to an officer and gentleman for violating a prior engagement promise to another woman, which led to his dismissal from the Navy. It was Lena who suggested the possibility of a career in the newly established SS. Heydrich's ideas for an SS intelligence service impressed Heinrich Himmler so much that he immediately appointed Heydrich as the chief of the newly formed intelligence service known later as the SD. This was not a minor contribution to history. Lena had effectively channeled her husband's ambitions into the precise organizational niche where he would do the most damage, creating the infrastructure of surveillance and terror that would eventually make the Holocaust administratively possible. As an acknowledgement of Heydrich's dedication to the Nazi cause, Hitler gifted Lena with a large estate in rural Bohemia. At the estate, she kept several prisoners for forced labor, and it is alleged that she physically abused them. The family resided there until April 1945, when they fled the approaching Soviet Red Army. After World War II, Lena was acquitted in the denazification proceedings. Through a couple of court battles against the West German government in 1956 and 1959, she successfully secured a pension, a contentious decision given her husband's pivotal role in organizing the Holocaust. Despite being convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in absentia by Czechoslovakia for war crimes, she managed to avoid serving the sentence. In 1965, during a vacation to Finland, she met and later married Finnish theatre director Mauno Manninen, a move primarily aimed at changing her surname. She tirelessly defended her first husband's reputation up until her passing at the age of 74 on August 14, 1985. Lena Heydrich was married to the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, the meeting at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the implementation of the final solution. She never expressed genuine remorse. Emmy Goering's story adds yet another dimension to the role of women in the Nazi power structure, because Emmy occupied perhaps the most publicly visible position of any Nazi wife during the pre-war years. Emmy Goering married the prominent Luftwaffe chief and senior Nazi Hermann Goering on April 10, 1935, in a ceremony that was essentially a state occasion. Interestingly, even though Emmy had not actively sought membership, she was gifted Nazi Party induction as a Christmas present in 1938. The anecdote tells you something important about how the regime worked. Belonging to the party was not always a matter of ideological conviction, but of social convenience and political expectation. Emmy held the responsibility of being Hitler's hostess at numerous state functions before the start of World War II. Her self-proclaimed status as the First Lady of the Third Reich led to a significant and revealing rift with Hitler's companion Eva Braun, whom Emmy openly disregarded and treated with disdain. This behavior resulted in Hitler demanding that Hermann Goering instruct his wife to treat Eva with due respect. Emmy was excluded from Hitler's Bavarian retreat, the Berghof, as a consequence. Emmy was in a position of significant power and wealth in Europe during World War II, enjoying a lavish lifestyle supported by her husband's ownership of mansions, estates, and castles in Austria, Germany, and Poland, many of them acquired through the confiscation of art and property from Jews and others classified as enemies by the Nazi regime. This wealth was not abstract or accidental. It was built directly on the suffering of the regime's victims. Upon their daughter Edda's birth, Hermann Goering commanded a tribute of 500 planes to fly over Berlin, stating that he would have doubled the number had it been a boy. After the war, a German denazification court found Emmy guilty of being a Nazi, leading to a year-long incarceration and the seizure of 30% of her remaining wealth. After her release, she managed to get a small apartment in Munich. She wrote an autobiography called My Life with Goering and passed away in Munich on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80. These women were not peripheral figures in the Third Reich. They were embedded in its social fabric, beneficiaries of its power, and in many cases active participants in its ideology. Their stories remind us that the Nazi regime was not a phenomenon produced by a small group of monstrous men operating in isolation from German society. It was a mass movement that drew enormous numbers of ordinary people, men and women, into complicity with its crimes, some through direct participation, some through willful blindness, and some through the kind of enthusiastic ideological commitment that made them eager servants of a system built on racial murder. The children of Nazi leaders inherited this legacy in ways that were often psychologically devastating and morally complex beyond easy resolution. Consider the life of Gudrun Himmler, born on August 8, 1929, the only child of Heinrich Himmler, who was one of the key architects of the Holocaust and the man most directly responsible for the administration of the death camps. Heinrich Himmler had a special fondness for his daughter, ensuring she was flown to his Berlin offices from her residence in Munich, making daily phone calls when she was at home and sending weekly letters. He affectionately referred to her by her childhood nickname, Puppy. She joined him during certain official functions. She was, by all accounts, genuinely beloved by a man who simultaneously organized the murder of millions of people. The cognitive dissonance required to hold these two realities in balance is staggering. Following World War II, both Gudrun and her mother were apprehended by American forces and detained in a series of camps in Italy, France, and Germany. They were summoned to Nuremberg to provide testimony at the trials and released in November 1946. What is remarkable and deeply disturbing is what happened next. Rather than confronting the reality of her father's crimes, Gudrun Himmler spent the rest of her long life defending his memory. She contested the widely accepted belief that her father had committed suicide by biting into a cyanide capsule after his capture, insisting instead that he had been assassinated. She became an integral part of Stille Hilfe, the silent aid organization that provided support to arrested, condemned and fugitive former SS members, essentially acting as an underground support network for war criminals. Her involvement with this organization was maintained for decades, a testament to the astonishing power of filial loyalty to override moral judgment. She remained a staunch supporter of her father until her death in 2018, having lived for 89 years in defense of a man who murdered millions. Martin Bormann Jr. presents a striking contrast, a child of the Nazi elite who chose a radically different path. The eldest son of Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery and one of Hitler's most powerful lieutenants, Bormann Jr. was born on April 14, 1930, and was only a child during the height of his father's power and the atrocities of World War II. Growing up under the shadow of his father's prominent position in Hitler's inner circle, his childhood was far from ordinary, yet the young Bormann was kept somewhat sheltered from the most gruesome reality of what the regime was doing. After the war, when he was confronted with the full horror of the actions attributed to his father, it led him on a genuine journey of remorse and redemption. He converted to Catholicism and devoted his life to the church, working in the mission fields of Congo and Cameroon, striving to make amends for his father's misdeeds. His path was not without its own complications. In 2011, he found himself at the center of abuse allegations involving a former student, allegations that were never legally adjudicated because Bormann was by then battling dementia. But the fundamental arc of his life represented an attempt, however imperfect, to break with the legacy he had inherited. Nicholas Frank, son of the infamous Nazi war criminal Hans Frank, chose perhaps the most aggressive form of reckoning with paternal legacy. Born in 1939, Frank was too young to understand the atrocities being committed during the Holocaust, but his adulthood was largely consumed by a quest to understand and publicly denounce his father's actions. Hans Frank, known as the Butcher of Poland, was Hitler's personal lawyer and later served as Governor-General of occupied Poland, presiding over a territory in which millions of Jews, Poles and other people were murdered. Nicholas Frank refused to look away from this reality. He has written several books, including In the Shadow of the Reich, that detail his efforts to comprehend his father's deeds and their impact on his life. His candid public discussions add a unique and often shattering perspective to Holocaust remembrance, the testimony of a man who loves and hates his father in equal measure, and has chosen to let that tension fuel a lifetime of public education about the consequences of unchecked hatred. Edda Göring, the only child of Hermann Göring and his second wife, actress Emmy Sonnemann, lived an almost entirely private life in the shadow of her father's notorious legacy. Born just before the eruption of World War II, her early years were spent at Karen Hall, the Goering family estate, surrounded by the luxury and privilege that came with her father's powerful position. She was often photographed at public events, a symbol of the Nazi regime's attempt to project an image of wholesome family life. She received numerous historic art pieces during her childhood, including a Lucas Cranach the Elder's Madonna and child painting. As the war neared its end, she and her mother relocated to their mountain residence at Obersalzberg near Berchtesgaden. Hermann Goering was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials for war crimes, though he escaped the gallows by committing suicide the night before his scheduled execution. This left Edda with a tainted legacy that she spent the rest of her life trying to reconcile with her genuine love for her parents. In the 1950s and 1960s, many of the valuable gifts she had received in her youth became embroiled in long legal disputes, most of which she lost in 1968. While other children of Nazi leaders like Gudrun Himmler actively participated in revisionist organizations and Nicholas Frank confronted his heritage publicly, Edda generally refrained from public discourse. During a 1986 television interview in Sweden, she broke her silence to express deep affection for both of her parents. She passed away in 2018. Rolf Mengele, son of the infamous Nazi doctor Josef Mengele, who had conducted murderous experiments on concentration camp prisoners at Auschwitz, lived a life shaped by the most extreme form of paternal horror imaginable. Born on March 16, 1944, Rolf was raised entirely away from the concentration camps where his father conducted his notorious experiments. He was led to believe his father had been a war hero and only learned the chilling truth as a young teenager. Despite the burden of his name, Rolf made efforts to lead a normal life, studying law and working as a corporate lawyer. After the war, Josef Mengele fled to South America, leaving his son behind and opening a correspondence that would eventually draw Rolf into a deeply ambiguous relationship with a man who had committed some of the worst individual crimes of the entire war. Nazi hunters believed Rolf maintained contact with his father, and to some extent they were correct. Mengele wrote several letters to his son, sparking Rolf's curiosity and leading him to make a journey to South America in 1977 to meet his father. Reflecting on that journey, Rolf acknowledged that his father displayed no guilt whatsoever for his horrific deeds at Auschwitz, even attempting to rationalize them. Despite despising his father and everything he represented, Rolf could not bring himself to betray him to the authorities. He kept silent about Mengele's South American hideout, and the notorious Angel of Death escaped justice. After their encounter, Rolf decided to alter his identity and sever ties with his past. He is believed to have led a quiet life in Germany as a retired attorney. His silence about his father's location remains, decades later, a moral burden that history will not let him lay down easily. Wolf Hess, the son of Rudolf Hess, stood at the other end of the moral spectrum from Nicholas Frank. Rather than distancing himself from his father's legacy or attempting to make amends, Wolf Hess spent his entire adult life defending Rudolf Hess and campaigning to change public perception of him. He tirelessly worked to prove that his father was not a war criminal, but rather a man simply carrying out his duties in the 1930s and early 1940s. In his teenage years, while his father was held captive following his ill-fated mission to Scotland, Wolf was a frequent visitor to his father's various places of detention. During the 1950s, Wolf established the Committee to Free Rudolf Hess, amassing several 100,000 supporters and including some notable figures in German politics. He authored numerous books advocating for the recognition of Hess as a German hero. Following Hess's death in prison on August 17, 1987, at the age of 93, Wolf contended that his demise was the result of foul play by his British captors. Wolf, who spent his entire life defending his father's Nazi affiliations, passed away in 2001. His story illustrates how the ideology of the Third Reich could persist in individual families long after the political structure that had produced it was destroyed. Albert Speer Jr. represents perhaps the most complicated of these inherited legacies. Born on July 29, 1934, in Berlin, just days before Hitler ascended to the position of Führer, Albert Jr.'s childhood years were spent in Berchtesgaden, where Hitler had a mountain retreat. There are films from the 1930s that depict a young Albert playing on the porch of Hitler's villa under the dictator's watchful gaze. His father, Albert Speer Sr., was Hitler's primary architect and Germany's armaments minister, a man whose organizational genius sustained Germany's weapons production, largely reliant on forced labor in ways that effectively extended the duration of the war by years. Speer Sr. was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He emerged as one of the few high-ranking Nazis who showed at least apparent remorse for the atrocities committed by the regime, though historians continue to debate whether that remorse was genuine or a calculated performance designed to save his life. Following his father's incarceration for war crimes, the Speer family took refuge with Albert Jr.'s grandparents in Heidelberg. During this difficult period, Albert Jr. developed a severe stutter which he eventually managed to overcome. He initially trained as a carpenter before shifting his focus to architecture, the same profession as his father. He was adamant throughout his career that his choice of architecture was not influenced by his father's example. In an interview with the Süddeutsche Zeitung in 2010, he expressed the determination that had guided his life. "I have tried my whole life to separate myself from my father, to distance myself." Albert Speer Jr. passed away at his Frankfurt residence on September 15, 2017. He was 83 years old. The distance he sought, the effort to build a life and a career not defined by his father's crimes, was itself a kind of testimony to the reach of the Third Reich across generations. These stories of children and wives reveal something essential about how the Third Reich sustained its power. It was not simply a military or political phenomenon. It was a social and familial one embedded in the personal relationships and domestic lives of millions of German people, creating bonds of loyalty, complicity, and belief that persisted long after the guns fell silent. The ideology was not just in the party rallies and the propaganda films. It was in the homes, the conversations at dinner tables, the letters between parents and children, the networks of friendship and mutual support that connected the leaders of the regime to the broader society that sustained them. The story of the Third Reich's power is also the story of the fields on which that power was deployed. Germany did not fight a single war between 1939 and 1945. It fought many simultaneous wars on multiple fronts across an enormous geographic range, from the deserts of North Africa to the Arctic wastes of Norway, from the English Channel to the suburbs of Stalingrad, from the fjords of Scandinavia to the olive groves of Italy. Managing this multi-front conflict required not just military genius but a logistical and administrative apparatus of enormous complexity. And the strains of managing such a dispersed campaign were themselves one of the factors that ultimately broke the Third Reich's power. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, which Hitler had always intended as the war's decisive ideological and strategic campaign, was made with a fundamental misunderstanding of what it would require. The Wehrmacht planners who drew up Operation Barbarossa assumed that the campaign would be decided in a matter of weeks, that the Soviet Union would fracture quickly under the shock of the initial German assault, and that a campaign of perhaps 4 to 5 months would be sufficient to secure the territory Hitler wanted and destroy the Soviet state as a functioning political entity. These assumptions were rooted partly in genuine military analysis of Soviet weaknesses, many of which were real, and partly in ideological fantasy about the fragility of what Nazi racial theory insisted was an inherently inferior civilization. The German generals who participated in the planning of Barbarossa were professionals who should have known better. Some of them expressed private reservations about the scope and ambition of the plan. Almost all of them suppressed those reservations and proceeded with the confidence that had been built by 5 years of stunning German victories against what turned out to be less formidable opponents. The campaign began brilliantly, as German campaigns usually did. In the first weeks, German armoured spearheads drove hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies in the process. The Minsk Pocket, the Smolensk Pocket, the Kiev Pocket, the Vyazma-Bryansk Pocket, these encirclements captured millions of Soviet soldiers and destroyed enormous quantities of Soviet equipment. On paper, the Soviet Union should have been at the point of collapse well before the end of 1941. But it was not. The Soviet government evacuated industrial facilities hundreds of miles eastward, out of German reach. New Soviet armies materialized from populations the Germans had not accounted for. The Red Army, though bled white in the opening months, kept fighting and kept learning. By the time the German advance finally stalled before Moscow in December 1941, it had become clear that Barbarossa had not delivered what it had promised, and Germany was now committed to a prolonged two-front war against an adversary with vastly greater resources and a demonstrated ability to absorb losses that would have destroyed any other army. The failure at Moscow in December 1941 was the moment when Germany's fundamental strategic dilemma became impossible to deny. Germany was not going to win a short war against the Soviet Union. It was going to fight a long war against the Soviet Union while simultaneously managing its occupation of Western Europe, its campaign in North Africa, and its naval war in the Atlantic. Given the relative sizes of the economies and populations involved, this was a war that Germany could not win in the long run. The question was only how long German military skill, German industrial effort, and German ideological commitment could delay the inevitable conclusion. The answer turned out to be longer than most people expected in December 1941, longer than it should have been given the military realities, and that prolongation of an ultimately unwinnable war cost millions of additional lives on all sides. The Eastern Front's brutal character, unlike anything seen in Western Europe, was shaped by the ideological framework within which the war in the East was fought. Hitler had explicitly designated the war against the Soviet Union as a war of racial and ideological annihilation, not a conventional military conflict between states. This had concrete consequences for how German forces treated the populations of the occupied territories. The Commissar Order and the Barbarossa Decree authorized the summary execution of Soviet political officers and authorized brutal reprisals against civilians, suspected of partisan activity. The starvation of Soviet prisoners of war in German camps was not an accidental consequence of logistical failures, but a deliberate policy. The mass murder of Jews in the occupied Soviet territories was carried out by Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units operating directly behind the advancing German armies, and the Wehrmacht's relationship with these murder squads ranged from active cooperation to passive complicity. The Eastern Front was not a separate story from the Holocaust. They were the same story. The military commanders whose careers we have explored in this video were all part of this story in one way or another. Lieb's Army Group North cooperated closely with SS Einsatzgruppen, engaged in mass murder. Küchler's forces were implicated in the murder of mentally disabled civilians and the brutal treatment of Soviet POWs. Kleist's 1st Panzer Army drove through territories where millions of Soviet civilians were killed or enslaved. Even commanders like Manstein, whose operational brilliance is genuinely admirable and who has sometimes been presented as a relatively clean commander, signed orders that permitted the murder of Jewish civilians and Soviet commissars and facilitated the work of the Einsatzgruppen, operating in his area of command. The Nuremberg principle that following orders is not an absolute defense cuts both ways. It establishes individual accountability for following illegal orders, but it also forces us to confront the individual choices that these men made, each in his own way, to serve a criminal regime and to implement its criminal policies, even when they had some degree of choice about how far to go. The German naval dimension of the war adds another layer to this portrait of German military power. Beyond the U-boat campaign, Germany's surface fleet posed significant strategic threats in the early years of the war, tying down substantial British naval resources that would otherwise have been available for other purposes. The battleship Bismarck's brief career in May 1941, when it sank the British battlecruiser HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, and was then hunted down and sunk in a massive British naval operation, illustrated both the capabilities and the limitations of German surface naval power. The German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine, never had the resources to challenge British naval supremacy on the surface, but it could and did force the British to maintain large forces that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. The battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, operating from French Atlantic ports, posed significant threats to British shipping in the early war years. The battleship Tirpitz, sheltering in Norwegian fjords for much of the war, pinned down substantial British naval forces simply by existing as a threat in what Churchill called a fleet-in-being strategy. The technological ambitions of the Third Reich extended well beyond the weapon systems that actually shaped the battlefield. Nazi Germany invested enormous resources in secret weapons programs that sometimes produced genuine technological breakthroughs and sometimes absorbed resources without producing militarily significant results. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 ballistic missile campaigns against Britain in 1944 and 1945 introduced the age of jet propulsion and rocketry to warfare, technologies whose military and civilian descendants continue to shape the world today. The jet aircraft programs that produced the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, came too late and in too small numbers to reverse the air war's outcome. But they demonstrated a level of aeronautical engineering that would directly influence post-war aviation in both East and West. Even in defeat, German technological innovation was feeding the future. The story of what made the Third Reich unstoppable is therefore also the story of what made it ultimately unstable. The same characteristics that produced its extraordinary early power, the ideological fanaticism, the willingness to take enormous risks, the dismissal of conventional strategic wisdom, the exploitation of everyone and everything in pursuit of total goals, were also the characteristics that made it impossible for the regime to sustain. A state that rests on fear and terror rather than genuine consent must eventually exhaust its capacity to generate fear at the required intensity. A military strategy based on annihilation and speed must eventually encounter adversaries resilient enough to absorb the initial shock and fight back with overwhelming resources. An ideology of racial supremacy will inevitably generate the united opposition of the peoples it designates as inferior. The Third Reich was unstoppable in the way a runaway train is unstoppable, terrifying, devastating to anything in its path, but always destined to reach a point where the track ends. Now we come to one of the most powerful and least understood components of the Third Reich's military dominance: the men in the black uniforms. The Waffen-SS, Hitler's elite military force, was not simply another branch of the German armed forces. It was something fundamentally different, a military organization explicitly grounded in ideological commitment, racial selection, and fanatical loyalty to the person of Adolf Hitler. To understand what made the Third Reich unstoppable in its prime, you have to understand what made the Waffen-SS different from the conventional Wehrmacht, and why that difference mattered so much on the battlefield. The origins of the Waffen-SS lay in Hitler's Schutzstaffel, or SS, which had begun as a personal bodyguard unit and evolved into the most powerful organization within the Nazi state. The idea of a separate military arm of the SS, distinct from the regular army, had developed gradually during the 1930s as Hitler sought to build a force that would be loyal not to the German state as an institution, but to him personally. The SS men were selected on the basis of racial criteria that reflected Nazi ideology in its most explicit form. They had to demonstrate Aryan ancestry going back several generations, meet rigorous physical standards, and demonstrate ideological commitment to National Socialism. The result was a force that combined genuine physical and military excellence with an ideological fanaticism that regular army commanders often found as troubling as it was effective. By the time the war reached its peak, the Waffen-SS had grown from a small personal guard into a force of nearly 1 million men, organized into dozens of divisions, including elite formations like Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, Totenkopf, and Viking, that were considered among the finest fighting formations in the entire German order of battle. What made the Waffen-SS so formidable on the battlefield? Several factors combined to create an exceptionally capable fighting force. The first was the quality of its personnel. SS men were in general younger, physically fitter, and more highly motivated than their Wehrmacht counterparts. They had been indoctrinated since childhood through the Hitler Youth with the values of sacrifice, comradeship, and unquestioning loyalty that the SS demanded. They genuinely believed they were fighting for something larger than themselves, and that belief gave them a ferocity and a willingness to sustain casualties that impressed and sometimes terrified both their allies and their enemies. The second factor was equipment. The Waffen-SS consistently received priority allocation of the newest and most powerful tanks, assault guns, and infantry weapons. By the middle years of the war, SS panzer divisions were equipped with the most formidable armoured vehicles in the German arsenal, including the Tiger I and Tiger II heavy tanks that outclassed anything the Allies could field in direct combat. The third factor was tactical training and initiative. SS commanders were trained in the same tradition of Auftragstaktik that characterized the best Wehrmacht officers, with an emphasis on independent judgment, aggressive action, and the relentless exploitation of any advantage gained. In battle after battle, SS units demonstrated an ability to react to changing circumstances faster than their opponents, to mount counterattacks when other units would have remained defensive, and to extract tactical success from situations that appeared hopeless. They were also, it must be said, capable of extraordinary brutality. The ideology that drove their ferocity in battle also drove atrocities against civilian populations and prisoners of war that were documented, prosecuted, and condemned as war crimes. The Waffen-SS was never the purely military organisation that its post-war apologists claimed. It was an ideological force that committed ideological violence, and the two aspects of its character were inseparable. May 1945. Nazi Germany had fallen. Across Europe, hundreds of thousands of Waffen-SS soldiers were laying down their arms. Once Hitler's so-called elite, they now found themselves prisoners of war or fugitives in a shattered continent. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, the Allied powers issued orders for the total dissolution of the SS and all its branches. Units of the Waffen-SS, from frontline divisions like Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and Das Reich to auxiliary formations drawn from occupied territories, were rounded up by American, British, and Soviet troops. Thousands were marched into captivity, often wearing the same uniform that had made them a symbol of terror just weeks before. The legal reckoning came quickly. At the Nuremberg trials, held from November 1945 to October 1946, prosecutors argued that the entire SS, including the Waffen-SS, had been a key instrument of Nazi crimes. On September 30th, 1946, the International Military Tribunal formally declared the SS a criminal organization. That judgment meant that simply belonging to the Waffen-SS could constitute a crime, though exceptions were made for those conscripted after 1943 or proven to have avoided ideological involvement. A few well-known figures, such as SS Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, were tried and imprisoned for atrocities committed in France and Belgium, including the murder of Canadian prisoners of war at the Abbey d'Ardennes in June 1944. Others faced military tribunals for their roles in massacres in Italy, the Balkans, and the Eastern Front. But the vast majority of lower-ranking men were released within months, their records marked but their lives largely intact. Conditions in post-war camps were harsh. Many prisoners were kept in improvised enclosures under the open sky, struggling with disease, hunger, and uncertainty. A minority chose flight. With forged papers and sympathetic networks, a number of ex-Waffen-SS officers escaped Europe altogether. Karl Nicolosi Lech, a former panzer commander decorated for his actions on the Eastern Front, reached Argentina in 1948, where he built a quiet life under Juan Perón's regime. Similar routes took other fugitives to Spain, Syria, and even Egypt. These escapes fueled stories of Nazi ratlines organized by clerical or intelligence circles, claims that remain partly documented and partly debated. For those who stayed in Germany, the early post-war years brought disillusionment and exclusion. The name Waffen-SS had become synonymous with brutality and fanaticism. Their veterans were excluded from employment, pensions, and even from official war grave commemorations. By 1948, Germany's new political authorities still considered the Waffen-SS a criminal entity, not a branch of the army. Yet the practical pressures of rebuilding a shattered society soon began to complicate these principles. The creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949 marked a new chapter not only for the nation, but also for the men who had worn the black uniform. By the early 1950s, political debates over veteran welfare dominated the Bundestag. The introduction of the Bundesversorgungsgesetz, the Federal War Victims Relief Act of 1950, became a turning point. Should men of the Waffen-SS receive benefits like regular Wehrmacht soldiers? Conservative politicians, including Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, eventually agreed that excluding them would risk alienating a large and organized voter base. In 1953, Adenauer publicly declared that the men of the Waffen-SS had fought as soldiers, just like others. That statement carried enormous symbolic weight, signaling West Germany's quiet shift toward normalizing Waffen-SS veterans as part of the broader soldier community. It was the beginning of a decades-long political and historical controversy about memory, responsibility, and the price of social reconciliation. By September 1956, when the question arose of whether former SS men could serve in the newly formed Bundeswehr, out of 3,117 former Waffen-SS applicants, just 508 were approved. The rest were rejected for ideological concerns, criminal records, or pressure from Allied advisors who feared the Bundeswehr could inherit a tainted legacy. Still, those who made it back into uniform often kept quiet about their wartime pasts. In 1951, a group led by Paul Hauser, Otto Kumm, and Felix Steiner founded HIAG, the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members. HIAG started as a welfare organization to support comrades denied state pensions and benefits. But it quickly evolved into something larger, a political and historical lobby whose central argument was that the Waffen-SS had been an apolitical fighting force, soldiers like any other. By the mid-1950s, HIAG had branches across West Germany and claimed tens of thousands of members, publishing the magazine Der Freiwillige, organizing reunions and financing the publication of memoirs that reframed SS divisions as elite military units rather than ideological forces. Paul Hauser's 1953 book Soldaten wie andere auch, or Soldiers Like Any Other, became the cornerstone of this myth. In 1978, a Der Spiegel investigation revealed HIAG's deep political ties and its attempts to pressure officials on pension reforms, marking a turning point in public tolerance. In 1992, facing dwindling ranks and public disapproval, HIAG officially dissolved. Today, scholars like Sönke Neitzel and Peter Longerich have analysed how ideology, discipline and violence fused within the Waffen-SS structure, emphasising that the organisation was never separate from Nazi politics. It was its armed extension. While the Waffen-SS represented the ideological cutting edge of the Third Reich's land power, there was another dimension of German military capability that came closer than almost anything else to deciding the outcome of the entire war. Between 1939 and 1943, Germany's U-boat fleet came terrifyingly close to severing Britain's supply lines across the Atlantic, which would have starved the island nation into submission and potentially ended the war in Germany's favour before America's industrial capacity could be brought fully to bear. The story of the U-boat campaign is the story of how a relatively small number of submarines, never more than a few hundred operational at any one time, managed to pose an existential threat to the most powerful naval alliance in history. Karl Dönitz was the architect of this campaign and one of the most pivotal naval figures of the entire Second World War. He commanded the U-boat fleet of the Kriegsmarine, igniting a battle in the depths of the Atlantic that would consume 4 years and cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides. As he rose to the rank of Grand Admiral, succeeding Erich Raeder, Dönitz developed and refined the Wolfpack tactic, in which groups of U-boats would coordinate their attacks on Allied convoys, overwhelming the escort vessels and penetrating deep into the merchant columns to sink as much tonnage as possible. From 1939 to 1943, his U-boats dominated vast stretches of the Atlantic, sending millions of tons of shipping to the bottom and threatening Britain's ability to sustain the war effort. The period that Dönitz and his crews called the Happy Time in 1940 and 1941 saw U-boats operating with almost impunity in the waters west of Britain, picking off merchant ships and tankers with devastating efficiency. There were months during which the Allies simply could not replace the shipping they were losing fast enough. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat campaign was the one threat that truly frightened him throughout the war. What made the U-boat campaign so effective was a combination of tactical innovation, the excellent quality of German submarine design, the courage and skill of their crews, and the initial inadequacy of Allied anti-submarine warfare. German submarines of the Type 7 class were excellent fighting machines, reliable, maneuverable, and equipped with an array of torpedoes and communications equipment that made them deadly opponents in the open ocean. The Wolfpack tactic exploited a fundamental weakness in convoy defense. With limited numbers of escort vessels, it was impossible to protect every point of a convoy's perimeter simultaneously. By coordinating attacks from multiple directions, U-boat Wolfpacks could overwhelm the escorts and devastate the merchant ships they were protecting. The tides began to turn against the U-boats from May 1943 onward, when a combination of improved radar technology, long-range patrol aircraft capable of covering the Black Gap in the mid-Atlantic, decoded Enigma communications that allowed the Allies to route convoys away from U-boat patrol lines, and a rapid expansion of Allied naval escort forces collectively tipped the balance against the submarine campaign. That month alone, the Kriegsmarine lost 41 U-boats, a catastrophic rate of attrition that could not be sustained. Dönitz briefly withdrew his forces from the North Atlantic in May 1943, acknowledging in his war diary that the Wolfpack tactics had failed against the improved Allied defences, but the U-boats never stopped fighting. They adapted, adopting new snorkel technology that allowed them to run their diesel engines while submerged, and continued to pose a significant threat until the final days of the war. When Nazi Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, more than 100 U-boats were still at sea. Within hours, Dönitz issued a simple but historic order. All U-boats were to cease operations, surface, and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. The long war beneath the Atlantic was over. Across the North Atlantic, the Bay of Biscay, and the fjords of Norway, more than 150 U-boats surfaced, their exhausted crews hoisting white flags as Allied aircraft circled overhead. They sailed toward ports such as Loch Eriboll in Scotland, Lissahalli in Northern Ireland, and Portland in southern England. At Loch Eriboll, nearly 40 U-boats anchored together in a grim parade of defeat. Allied warships escorted the submarines into port, where Royal Navy and US Navy boarding parties seized codes, charts, and weapons. Engineers catalogued the rusted, battle-scarred vessels, many barely seaworthy after months underwater. In the following weeks, Allied leaders faced a pressing question: what to do with the world's most advanced submarine fleet? The United States and Britain saw immense intelligence value in the revolutionary Type 21 and 23 designs, while the Soviet Union demanded its share of the captured technology. The answer came in the form of Operation Deadlight. By the autumn of 1945, the Allies had gathered more than 100 surrendered U-boats in British harbours. Keeping them afloat was costly, and storing them indefinitely was impossible. The Royal Navy approved Operation Deadlight, a plan to tow the captured submarines out into the Atlantic and sink them. Between November 1945 and February 1946, 116 U-boats were designated for destruction. The Royal Navy divided the operation into 3 dumping areas roughly 100 to 120 nautical miles northwest of Ireland, where the submarines would be sunk by naval gunfire, explosive charges, or by simply opening their sea valves. The logistics were daunting. Many of the U-boats were in dreadful condition after months without maintenance, battered by Allied bombing or deliberate sabotage. Their ballast tanks leaked, their engines seized, and their hulls were weakened by rust. In stormy winter seas, towing these unstable wrecks was a hazardous task. As a result, more than a third of the U-boats never made it to the scuttling zones. 56 vessels foundered or sank on the way, dragged down by rough weather or structural failure. Among the doomed submarines was U-2336, the last U-boat to sink Allied ships during the war. It surrendered at Lissahalli in June 1945 and was deliberately sunk off Ireland in January 1946. The U-2511, Germany's only fully operational Type 21 at the war's end, was scuttled last on February 7, 1946, marking the official conclusion of Operation Deadlight. Not all U-boats were destroyed. The most advanced examples, the Type 21 and Type 23 boats, were spared for study. The Tripartite Naval Commission, formed in August 1945, allocated the surrendered fleet between the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Each received 10 U-boats for examination. Their streamlined hulls, greater battery capacity, and snorkel systems represented a revolutionary step in submarine design, and the Soviet Union's acquisition of several Type 21 boats served as direct templates for the later Whiskey-class submarines, giving the Soviet fleet a sudden technological leap forward. Particularly significant was U-234, a long-range cargo submarine captured on May 14, 1945, while en route to Japan with a secret payload that included uranium oxide and jet engine components. US Navy engineers studied its construction and cargo before sinking it during weapons tests in 1947. Among the survivors, U-995 eventually became a museum ship at Le Beau near Kiel, and U-505, captured intact in June 1944, was transferred to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where it remains today as the first enemy warship ever displayed on American soil. For decades, the Deadlight wrecks lay forgotten on the seabed. Between 2001 and 2003, maritime archaeologist Innes McCartney led expeditions that rediscovered many of them, identifying at least 14 intact U-boat hulls preserved in the cold Atlantic mud. Over 30,000 German submariners and countless Allied sailors never returned from the Battle of the Atlantic. Their sacrifice on both sides is the human measure of what the U-boat campaign truly cost. After Hitler's demise, Dönitz succeeded him as head of state in the Flensburg government and directed the signing of Germany's unconditional surrender. Tried as a primary war criminal at Nuremberg, he faced charges of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. While acquitted of crimes against humanity, he was found guilty of the other charges and served a 10-year sentence in Berlin's Spandau prison. After his release in 1956, Dönitz relocated to a small town near Hamburg. In 1958, he published his autobiography, Memoirs 10 Years and 20 Days, passionately claiming that he had no knowledge of Hitler's crimes. Dönitz passed away in 1980 after a prolonged illness. His memoir, like his career, raises questions that no amount of professional achievement can fully answer. To bring all of these threads together, we must return to the central question: what really made the Third Reich unstoppable, at least for as long as it was? The answer is not simple, and anyone who gives you a simple answer is not being honest with the complexity of history. But several factors stand out as decisive. The first was ideological cohesion. The Nazi regime created a total mobilization of German society around a project of national regeneration and racial supremacy that gave millions of people a sense of purpose and belonging that the chaos of the Weimar Republic had denied them. This mobilization drew in professionals and workers, soldiers and civilians, men and women, the educated and the uneducated, through a combination of genuine conviction, social pressure, material benefit, and in some cases outright terror. The women who stood behind the regime's leaders were not passive accessories. They were believers, networkers, and in some cases active participants in its crimes. The children who grew up within the system absorbed its values deeply enough that some of them, like Gudrun Himmler and Wolf Hess, carried those values to their graves. The second was military innovation. The concept of blitzkrieg, the integrated use of armor, motorized infantry, artillery and air power in fast-moving combined arms operations guided by Auftragstaktik, represented a genuine revolution in military thinking that no other army in the world had fully grasped in 1939. The commanders who gave this doctrine its operational expression, men like Manstein, Kleist, Kesselring, and Rundstedt, were among the finest military minds of their generation. Their opponents were not fools or cowards. They were simply operating with a different set of assumptions about how modern war should be fought, and those assumptions turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The third was the quality of the fighting forces themselves. The Waffen-SS, whatever its crimes, was an exceptionally capable military organization, whose training, equipment, and motivation gave it an edge over almost every opponent it faced. The U-boat arm, under Dönitz, developed and executed a submarine campaign that came closer than any other single weapon system to winning the war for Germany. The German soldier in general, at every level from private to field marshal, fought with a quality of tactical skill, initiative, and determination that compelled the grudging respect of even the adversaries who eventually defeated him. German generals assessed Allied commanders like Patton with the professional judgment of men who understood military excellence when they encountered it and recognized in Patton a mirror of their own best qualities, translated into American idiom. The fourth, paradoxically, was also what ultimately made the Third Reich very stoppable. The ideology that mobilized German society and gave the Waffen-SS its fanatical edge was also the ideology that guaranteed the implacable opposition of nearly the entire rest of the world. Hitler's racial worldview led him to underestimate the Soviet Union, to mismanage the relationship with Britain, to guarantee American hostility, and to make strategic decisions based on ideological assumptions that had no basis in military reality. The same system that produced brilliant commanders like Manstein also produced Keitel's sycophantic deference to Hitler's increasingly irrational orders, and eventually the disastrous decisions of 1941 and 1942 that overextended German military power beyond any possibility of recovery. The Third Reich was unstoppable when it was fighting wars it could win quickly and decisively. It was always going to be stopped the moment it became locked in a prolonged struggle against adversaries with greater industrial resources, larger populations, and an ultimately superior capacity for adaptation and learning. Field Marshal Wilhelm List's career encapsulates this arc perfectly. After the First World War, he remained in the reduced Reichswehr, helping modernize Germany's military under the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. With the outbreak of World War II, he played a key role in the German invasion of Poland in 1939, earned Hitler's favor, and by 1940 was promoted to Field Marshal. One of his most notable assignments was leading German forces during the Balkan Campaign in 1941, commanding the army group that drove through Yugoslavia and Greece with stunning speed. However, List's involvement in the Balkans also connects him to the darker aspects of the war. The region saw brutal repression, mass executions, and harsh reprisals against partisans and civilians. In 1942, his career ended abruptly during Case Blue, the German summer offensive on the Eastern Front. Tasked with capturing the vital oil fields of the Caucasus, his forces faced logistical challenges and fierce Soviet resistance, and when the operation faltered, Hitler dismissed him from command. He was arrested by Allied forces, tried in the hostages trial where German generals were prosecuted for war crimes in the Balkans, and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1948. He was released in 1953 due to ill health. He continued to live for 19 more years, passing away on August 17, 1971, at the age of 91. His post-war longevity, living out his days while the crimes committed under his command remained unfully accounted for, is one of the persistent moral discomforts of the period. Georg von Küchler's trajectory was similar. He joined the German army in 1900, rose through the ranks during World War I, specialized in artillery during the interwar years, and reached his peak during World War II, commanding the 18th Army and later Army Group North in the invasion of the Soviet Union. He was promoted to Field Marshal in 1942. By early 1944, with the Red Army making significant advances, Küchler was relieved of his command by Hitler due to his failure to halt the Soviet counteroffensives. At the end of the war, he was arrested by the American Army. Unlike some of his counterparts who died before trial or evaded prosecution on medical grounds, Küchler faced the consequences of his actions. In the High Command trial, he stood accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Soviet Union, including the murder of mentally disabled individuals in occupied territories. During the proceedings, Küchler admitted to the harsh conditions in POW camps, but attributed them primarily to winter conditions, which he described as an act of God. He also claimed that the army had exaggerated POW mortality rates to receive more supplies. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. His sentence was reviewed and reduced to 12 years in 1951, and he was released from prison in February 1953, having served less than a decade for his crimes. He went on to live with his wife in the Garmisch region and passed away in Garmisch-Partenkirchen on May 25, 1968. Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb's case represents one of the most controversial post-war outcomes of any German commander. Lieb commanded Army Group C during the invasion of France in 1940, playing a key role in the rapid defeat of French forces, a success that earned him a promotion to Field Marshal. On March 30, 1941, Lieb was among over 200 senior military officers who attended a speech delivered by Adolf Hitler, in which Hitler detailed his vision for an ideological war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. During Operation Barbarossa, Lieb was assigned to lead Army Group North, advancing through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. His forces were implicated in war crimes against civilians, cooperating closely with SS Einsatzgruppen, responsible for mass executions, particularly targeting the Jewish population. Lieb was also involved in transmitting the Barbarossa Decree, which authorized the killing of Soviet political commissars and harsh treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. On January 15, 1942, Lieb requested that Hitler either grant him autonomy in his command or relieve him, and Hitler chose to relieve him. He was never given another command. Lieb was tried in the High Command trial. Despite serious allegations, his trial resulted in a surprisingly lenient sentence. His defense attorney portrayed him as a humane soldier who had not knowingly transmitted criminal orders, and the court convicted him of transmitting the Barbarossa Decree and its criminal application by subordinate units. However, he received only a 3-year imprisonment sentence, effectively time served. The judgment stated that no criminal order bearing his signature or stamp of approval had been introduced into evidence. What makes this outcome particularly troubling is the evidence of his material relationship with the regime. Despite receiving what amounted to a light sentence, Lieb had accepted secret gifts from the Nazi regime worth 250,000 Reichsmarks and an estate valued at 660,000 Reichsmarks. These were not tokens, they were rewards for loyalty and compliance. After his release, Lieb returned to his estate in Hohenschwangau, Bavaria, and passed away following a heart attack in 1956. His case exemplifies the complexities of post-war trials, where some high-ranking officers received minimal punishment despite significant levels of complicity, potentially undermining the principles of accountability that the trials were meant to uphold. Maximilian von Weichs commanded the Second Army during major military campaigns, including the invasions of France, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. In 1944, he was appointed commander of German forces in the Balkans, where his responsibilities included suppressing partisan resistance movements in Yugoslavia and Greece. His tenure in the Balkans was characterized by brutal anti-partisan operations and widespread atrocities against civilians. Weichs retired from his military career on March 25, 1945, and was arrested by American troops in May. He was scheduled to participate in the U.S. Army's hostages trial, facing charges related to the suppression of partisans in the Balkans. In a surprising turn of events, Weichs was removed from the proceedings before being judged or sentenced, the official reason given being medical reasons. This decision allowed Weichs to evade prosecution, despite his alleged involvement in serious wartime atrocities. Maximilian von Weichs died on September 27, 1954, in Bonn, West Germany, at the age of 72. The medical excuse that spared him from trial is a reminder of how often the machinery of justice found ways to accommodate powerful men with deteriorating health. So what is the final verdict? What really made the Third Reich unstoppable between 1933 and 1945? It was a system. Not a single genius, not a single weapon, not a single ideology in isolation, but a system in which all these elements reinforced each other to create something greater and more terrible than any of its individual parts. Military commanders of genuine world-class talent operated a revolutionary doctrine of mobile warfare that their opponents could not initially match. An ideologically motivated elite force in the form of the Waffen-SS provided shock troops of ferocious capability wherever the situation was most desperate. A naval arm under Karl Dönitz came closer than perhaps any other single campaign to winning the war through economic strangulation. The families and social networks of the Nazi inner circle sustained an ideological commitment that kept the machine running even as the military situation deteriorated. And at the center of it all was a propaganda system of unprecedented sophistication that maintained popular belief in the regime's mission long after the evidence of reality should have shattered it. But here is the thing about systems. They fail in systemic ways. The same ideology that empowered the Waffen-SS also blinded German strategic planners to the reality of Soviet resilience and American industrial capacity. The same micromanagement instincts that had driven Hitler to dismiss Brauchitsch and Lieb eventually drove him to dismiss Manstein and Kleist, stripping the German army of its best operational minds at the moments they were needed most. The same family and social networks that bound the Nazi inner circle together in loyalty also bound them in mutual delusion, creating an echo chamber in which bad news was suppressed and catastrophic decisions were validated by yes-men in high positions. The Third Reich was unstoppable when it was fighting wars it had designed for itself. When history forced it to fight a different kind of war against the combined productive capacity of the Soviet Union, the British Empire and the United States, all operating on exterior lines with growing industrial and manpower advantages, the system that had made Germany so formidable became the system that guaranteed its destruction. The men and women whose lives we have explored in this video lived through the full arc of that story, from the intoxicating triumphs of 1939 and 1940 to the catastrophic collapse of 1945 and the long, uncomfortable aftermath in which justice was sometimes served, sometimes evaded, and sometimes reduced to a compromise that satisfied nobody. Field marshals who had commanded armies found themselves in the dock at Nuremberg or dying in Soviet prison camps. Elite SS officers who had considered themselves the racial elite of a 1,000-year empire lived out their days collecting small pensions and attending reunions of an organization that history had condemned. The children of the men who built the Reich grew up carrying names that were synonyms for atrocity, some running from that inheritance, some defending it, and some spending their lives trying to understand what it meant. The wives of the regime's leaders lived through a strange post-war twilight, some prosecuted lightly, some escaping prosecution entirely, almost all of them maintaining to the end some version of a story in which they had been bystanders rather than participants. The Third Reich was unstoppable until it was not. What ended it was not weakness at the level of the individual soldier or commander. What ended it was the fundamental incompatibility between the totalitarian, racist ideology that powered the machine and the reality of a world in which human beings of every race and nation proved themselves capable of extraordinary courage, ingenuity, and determination. The Germans had the best operational commanders. They had the most innovative tactical doctrine. They had weapons that were in many cases technically superior to anything their opponents fielded. What they did not have was a vision of the future that could sustain the loyalty and fighting power of their enemies. And ultimately, they did not have a vision of the world that was true. And in the end, reality always wins. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that it gave you a deeper understanding of the many forces that made the Third Reich such a formidable power during those 12 dark years between 1933 and 1945. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Germany's field marshals after World War II, and our video about where did the Waffen-SS go after 1945, both of which go into even greater depth on some of the specific stories we touched on today. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.